Welcome back to Creep, where we delve into the darkest corners of human experience and the supernatural. Tonight, we bring you 5 chilling tales from those who guard the resting places of the dead, the Cemetery Night Watchmen. These first-hand accounts, narrated in their own words, reveal the eerie and often terrifying experiences that come with watching over the departed. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. I had been working as a night watchman at Lowell Cemetery for several years. The job was usually quiet, offering me plenty of time to reflect as I patrolled the grounds. One foggy night, as I made my rounds near the older section of the cemetery, I noticed a figure in the distance. It was a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Thinking it was a visitor who had lost track of time, I approached her to inform her that the cemetery was closed. As I got closer, she turned to face me, and I was struck by her pale complexion and hollow eyes. Before I could speak, she vanished into the mist, leaving me standing there, heart pounding. The next day, I mentioned the encounter to a colleague who told me about the legend of the Lady in White. According to local lore, she was a young mill worker who died tragically and is said to roam the cemetery at night, searching for her lost love. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond explanation. During my tenure as a night watchman at a historic cemetery in New Orleans, I experienced many strange occurrences, but none as unsettling as the night I heard the singing. It was a humid summer evening, and the air was thick with the scent of magnolias. As I walked among the tombs, I began to hear faint voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but the sounds grew louder and more distinct. It was a choir, singing a mournful hymn in perfect harmony. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the voices were coming from a mausoleum that hadn't been opened in decades. Summoning my courage, I approached the structure and pressed my ear against the cold stone door. The singing continued, clear and haunting. I called out, but there was no response. Suddenly, the singing stopped and eerie silence fell over the cemetery. I stepped back, my heart racing, and decided it was best to leave the area. To this day, I can't explain what I heard. There were no signs of anyone else in the cemetery, and the mausoleum remained sealed. The experience left me questioning the boundary between the living and the dead. In the early 1990s, I worked as a night watchman at a rural cemetery in Mississippi. One night, while patrolling the grounds, I noticed a faint light flickering among the graves. As I approached, I saw a man digging at a fresh grave, a lantern by his side. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, startling him. He dropped his shovel and took off into the woods, leaving the lantern behind. I reported the incident to the authorities, and they managed to apprehend him the next day. During his interrogation, the man confessed that he had been hired to steal valuables from the graves. He also revealed that he had been experiencing strange occurrences since he started. Whispers in the dark, shadows following him, and an overwhelming sense of dread. A week after his arrest, I learned that the grave robber had died in his cell, apparently from a heart attack. Some say it was the stress of being caught, but others believe he was cursed for disturbing the dead. I couldn't help but wonder if the spirits he had wronged had exacted their revenge. Working the night shift at a cemetery in Georgia, I had grown accustomed to the solitude and the sounds of the night. One evening, as I walked near the children's section of the cemetery, I heard the faint sound of laughter. It was a child's giggle, light and innocent. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The laughter came again, this time accompanied by the sound of small footsteps running through the grass. I followed the sounds, calling out to see if a child had somehow wandered into the cemetery, but there was no response. As I neared a particular gravestone, the sound stopped abruptly. The headstone belonged to a young girl who had died decades earlier. A chill ran down my spine as I realized there was no living child in the cemetery that night. From then on, I occasionally heard the laughter during my shifts, always near the same area. I came to believe that the spirit of the little girl was still playing among the graves, her laughter a reminder that some souls never truly leave. My time as a night watchman at a cemetery bordered by dense woods was mostly uneventful. However, there was one night that still haunts me. I was making my rounds when I noticed movement at the tree line. Assuming it was a deer or some other animal, I paid it little mind. As I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned my flashlight toward the woods and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. They were too high off the ground to belong to an animal, and they didn't waver under the light. I called out, demanding to know who was there, but received no answer. The eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking. I took a step closer, and the eyes suddenly disappeared, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest. The next morning, I inspected the area and found large footprints leading from the woods to the cemetery fence. They didn't match any animal tracks I was familiar with, and the distance between each step suggested a creature of considerable size. I never saw the eyes again, but the experience left me with a lingering unease. Whatever watched me that night was not of this world, and I couldn't help but feel that the cemetery was home to more than just the spirits of the departed. I had only been working as a cemetery night watchman for a few months when I first heard it, the soft, eerie sound of whistling. It was a quiet, mournful tune that seemed to drift through the air, carried by a breeze that made the leaves rustle in an unnatural harmony. I was stationed at a small cemetery in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. The whistling always started around 2 a.m., when the night was at its deepest. At first, I thought it might be a prank. Perhaps some local kids trying to scare the new guy. I walked the perimeter, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but found nothing. The whistling would stop the moment I tried to get close, resuming only when I was back at my post. One night, I decided to wait by a cluster of older graves where the sound seemed strongest. As I crouched behind a headstone, the whistling began again, closer this time. My skin prickled as the temperature dropped suddenly. Slowly, I peeked over the headstone and saw a figure, a tall, gaunt man in old-fashioned clothing, his lips pursed as he walked among the graves. His form seemed translucent, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped at a grave, knelt down, and continued his tune. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. When the light came back, he was gone. I rushed to the grave where I had seen him, my knees trembling. The headstone was so worn that most of the inscription was illegible, but I could still make out the name, Edward Malone. I did some research the next day and found that Edward Malone had been a local musician who died in the 1800s under mysterious circumstances. Some say he was buried alive after a fever left him in a death-like state. His whistling, they claim, was heard by grave diggers for days after his burial. I never heard the tune again, but the memory of that mournful melody still haunts me. My shift at Oak Hill Cemetery in upstate New York had been uneventful for years. The cemetery featured a large, ornate mausoleum that housed the remains of a wealthy family from the early 1900s. The structure had always given me an uneasy feeling, but nothing had ever happened until one stormy night. The rain was coming down hard, and thunder rattled the windows of my small guard booth. During my rounds, I noticed the door of the mausoleum slightly ajar. This was odd, as it was always kept locked. Thinking maybe vandals had forced their way in, I drew my flashlight and approached cautiously. The air inside was cold, far colder than it had any right to be, and smelled of damp stone and decay. My flashlight cast long shadows against the marble walls, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, facing a tomb. It was a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, with no discernible features, just an unsettling void. I called out, but the figure remained still. I took a step forward, and it turned to face me, though it had no face to speak of. An overwhelming wave of dread washed over me, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The shadow began to move toward me, gliding soundlessly over the floor. I bolted, slamming the door shut behind me. I called the groundskeeper, and together we inspected the mausoleum in the morning. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared disturbed. The door, which had been ajar the night before, was locked securely. I asked around and learned that the mausoleum belonged to the Whitmore family. Legend had it that one of the Whitmore sons had practiced dark rituals and was rumored to have cursed the family crypt before his own untimely death. Many believe his spirit was bound to the mausoleum, guarding his secrets for eternity. I transferred to a different cemetery shortly after, unwilling to spend another night in the presence of that shadow. When I took the job at Greenvale Cemetery, I expected the occasional eerie noise or unsettling shadow. After all, cemeteries have a natural way of getting under your skin. What I didn't expect was the sound of children laughing at midnight. It started as faint giggles, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The cemetery was old, and many of the graves belonged to children who had died during a smallpox outbreak in the late 1800s. The section of the cemetery where they were buried was marked by tiny, weathered headstones, some adorned with worn-down carvings of cherubs and lambs. One night, as I approached that section, I saw them, small figures darting between the headstones. Their laughter echoed in the stillness, playful yet sinister. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only response was more giggling. My flashlight landed on a small boy standing by a headstone. His clothes were old-fashioned, his skin pale and translucent. His eyes were dark, hollow pits. He tilted his head, and more children emerged from the shadows, all with the same lifeless gaze. Fear rooted me in place as they moved closer, their small hands reaching out. The air grew cold, and I felt as if I were sinking into the ground. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, the laughter following me all the way back to my booth. The next day, I found tiny footprints in the mud around the children's graves, though no children had been there. I told my supervisor, but he just laughed it off. I've since left that job, but I still hear those giggles in my dreams, and every so often, I wake to the sound of small footsteps outside my window. These accounts offer a glimpse into the eerie and often unexplainable experiences of those who stand guard over the resting places of the dead. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, it's clear that cemeteries hold mysteries that continue to baffle and terrify. If you enjoyed these stories, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling tales from Creep. And remember, the next time you pass by a cemetery at night, be mindful of the eyes that might be watching from the shadows.